Welcome to Michigan's WW1 Centennial News Report for June 2016, the Liberty Truck. I'm your host, Dennis Skupinski. During this program, we're going to look at the development of the Standard B Liberty Truck by the U.S. Army. We're going to look at who manufactured it, how it was used during the war, and also how it changed America. WW1 Centennial National News. President Barack Obama has announced the appointment of Ambassador Todd Sedgwick as a commissioner on the United States WW1 Centennial Commission. Formerly a U.S. ambassador to the Slovak Republic, Sedgwick is a fellow at the Transatlantic Center at the St. Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Study and a senior fellow at the Center for the Study of Presidency and Congress. There are 3 commissioners appointed by the President of the United States, 6 by Congress, 1 by each the VFW, the American Legion, and the National WW1 Museum and Memorial in Kansas City, Missouri. WW1 Centennial Michigan News. Senate Bill 670, the WW1 Centennial Act, was submitted by Rebecca Warren on December 15, 2015. It was immediately referred to the Committee from Veterans, Military Affairs, and Homeland Security. On June 7th, it was referred to the Committee of the Whole. Please contact your state senator and state assembly person and let them know that you want Senate Bill 670 passed. A century ago, June 1916. On June 1st ended the Battle of Jutland, the only large-scale naval battle between the German High Seas Fleet and the British Grand Fleet. At Jutland, the Germans, with 99 ships in their fleet, sank 115,000 tons of British ships, while the British, with 151 ships, sank 62,000 tons of German ships. The British loss of seamen was 6,094. The Germans lost 2,551. On the tactical level, the German High Seas Fleet won the battle, but strategically, the British Grand Fleet controlled the seas. The Reserve Officer Training Corps, ROTC, has celebrated the centennial of its establishment, which took place on the eve of America's entry into World War I. The ROTC was born out of concern about the nation's ability to expand its officer corps rapidly in wartime. 100 years later, the ROTC is the largest source of officers in the U.S. Armed Forces. June 4, 1916, 4 Russian armies on the Eastern Front, under their innovative new commander, General Alexei Brusilov, began a general offensive in the southwest along a 300-mile front. Brusilov avoids the style of predictable narrow front line attacks used previously, in favor of a sweeping offensive over hundreds of miles that is harder to pin down. Thinly stretched Austro-Hungarian troops defending this portion of the front are taken by surprise. Realizing their distress, the Germans pull 4 divisions from Verdun and send them east. By the end of the summer, the Germans will send 20 more divisions and merge the surviving Austro-Hungarian troops into the German army. On Monday, June 5, 1916, at 4:40 p.m., the HMS Hampshire, a British cruiser, left Scapa Flow. On board were 643 men, as well as Lord Kitchener, Minister of War, and his staff. Unbeknownst to the captain and her crew, Scapa Flow had been visited by a German U-boat at the end of May. Undetected, U-75 lay 22 miles off the coast of Scapa Flow. Bad weather at the beginning of June prevented the routine sweep of the area, so all the mines were out there as the Hampshire sailed on. Struggling against the wind, the Hampshire could only make 13.5 knots and roughly 1.5 miles from shore. At 7:45, an urgent telegram message was sent. A mile and a half out to sea, an explosion had shaken the whole ship and power had failed. She had been unable to radio for assistance. She began to sink. There were only 12 survivors from the HMS Hampshire. Lord Kitchener and his staff had all perished. June 22, 1916, the Germans resumed their offensive near Verdun. Using poisonous phosphine gas to start the attack, they initially take the village of Fleury, just 2 miles north of Verdun, but further advancement southward is halted by a strong French counterattack. Verdun has now become a battle of attrition for both sides, with a death toll already approaching 500,000 men. The Liberty truck was designed by the Motor Transport Section of the Quartermaster Corps in cooperation with members of the Society of Automotive Engineers. Production of the 3 to 5 ton truck began in 1917, and the first models appeared 10 weeks after the design was standardized. Of the almost 9,500 trucks produced by 15 manufacturers, more than 7,500 were sent overseas. The Liberty's 4-speed transmission, coupled with its 52 horsepower engine, gave the truck a top speed of about 15 miles per hour. During the punitive raids in Mexico during 1960, the Army had experience with motorized trucks. It was obvious that the truck's mobility, endurance, and speed far exceeded the ability of the conventional horse-drawn wagon, but maintenance was a nightmare. The Quartermaster Corps realized that a truck of standard design and interchangeable parts was a requirement for the Army. A committee was formed of quartermaster officers, Society of Automotive Engineers, and volunteers from the truck manufacturing companies to design a standard Army truck. The design committee agreed that a 3 to 5 ton large cargo hauler was the most critical need for the Army. The truck needed a large engine, large gas tank, large radiator, and maximum ground clearance. The committee also agreed not to use existing commercial designs in order to avoid delay in production by patent infringement. By October of 1917, 2 prototype trucks were driven overland to the War Department in Washington, D.C. for extensive trials. The results were so successful that by mid-November, the government had signed contracts for all the interchangeable components. The Liberty truck's powertrain utilized a gasoline-powered 425 cubic inch flathead inline 4-cylinder that produced 52 horsepower with a 4-speed transmission and a 4x2 drive setup. In March of 1916, a Mexican revolutionary leader named Pancho Villa attacked Columbus, New Mexico. The U.S. reaction was swift. Ordered by President Wilson to capture Pancho Villa by whatever means necessary, General John J. Pershing mounted an expedition comprised of regular and National Guard troops in the Federal service. To supply his force, Pershing called for 5 motor transport supply trains of 27 vehicles each. Since the entire Army possessed less than 1,000 motor vehicles of all types at the time, Pershing's demand seemed outrageous. Nevertheless, he got what he asked for, and the expedition proceeded into Mexico. As the campaign proceeded, there was a need for more motor transport, until over 500 vehicles were assigned to the expedition. A supply depot of spare parts was established in Columbus, New Mexico, which was the jumping-off point for the expedition. The troops penetrated 400 miles into Mexico. The Army had trucks from 128 different manufacturers. The parts supply system was a nightmare. Maintenance and repair for the vehicles was beyond the capability of the Army at the time, so it was necessary to hire civilian mechanics. There was also a scramble to recruit soldiers with mechanical aptitude or experience. After 11 months, the U.S. and Mexican governments negotiated their differences. Pancho Villa was never captured, but the Army did learn some lessons from the Mexican campaign. The days of the horse-drawn supply train were numbered. The new supply link between the railheads and the troops would be Army trucks. The manufacturing of Liberty trucks began in April of 1918 and did not stop till the end of the war. The first trucks reached France in October of 1918. After being manufactured in the United States and to save shipping space, they were shipped in a partially disassembled state, and assembly yards in France were set up to prepare the vehicles for use. By the end of the war, over 8,000 trucks had reached France. These rugged trucks, utilizing available parts, were easy to maintain and buttressed the entire war effort. Truck manufacturers in 1918 had produced 10 times the number of trucks they produced in 1912. Some of the Michigan companies that were involved in the design and manufacture of the Liberty truck are Republic Motor Truck Company, Alma, Michigan; Denby Motor Truck Company, Detroit, Michigan; Packard Motor Car Company, Detroit, Michigan; Russell Axle Company, North Detroit, Michigan; Timken Detroit Axle Company, Detroit, Michigan; Hinckley Motor Company, Detroit, Michigan; Continental Motor Company, Detroit, Michigan; McCord Manufacturing Company, Detroit, Michigan; Covert Gear Company, Detroit, Michigan; and Detroit Gear and Machine Company from Detroit, Michigan. The Liberty truck holds a unique place in American history. It was one of the first contracts between the American military and the automobile companies. This allowed the military to tap into the vast economic resources of the automobile companies with its assembly line manufacturing. This allowed the American military to ramp up production of weapons when needed. They also would have a supply of spare parts in order to maintain the weapons, and they could train a class of technicians called mechanics in order to keep these operating. This also helped the transition from horse and mule transport to motor transport, which would be most important 20 years later during World War II, as the United States had the most advanced motor transport corps in the world. Finally, the Liberty truck could go almost anywhere at any time, and this allowed the military and civilian companies to determine which was the cheapest way to send their goods and services, whether it was across the country, across the state, or even across town. The Liberty truck ushered in a new era for the American military. They were no longer dominated by rail or horse transportation. With the truck, they could go anywhere at any time. Transcontinental Motor Convoy. In the summer of 1919, a young lieutenant colonel named Dwight D. Eisenhower participated in the First Army Transcontinental Motor Convoy. The expedition consisted of 81 motorized Army vehicles that crossed the United States from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco, a venture covering 3,251 miles in 62 days. The expedition was manned by 24 officers and 258 enlisted men. The convoy was to test the mobility of the military during wartime conditions. As an observer for the War Department, Lieutenant Colonel Eisenhower learned firsthand of the difficulties faced in traveling great distances on roads that were impassable, and that resulted in frequent breakdowns of the military vehicles. These early experiences influenced later decisions concerning the building of the interstate highway system during his presidential administration. In 1956, President Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956. It has touched every American in one way or another. It's considered to be his most important achievement during his 2 terms in office.